we are here at the Tower-Soudan State Park, and I am Kathy Wagenbach Siskar, and with me is Cookie Hendrickson Bonacato, and we have our cinematographer with us also, and we are here interviewing Andy Larson, and Andy Larson has grown up in this area, and we're going to have him share with us and for you some of his thoughts about his upbringing and some of his experiences at the mine. So, Andy, let's start off with a little bit of information from your childhood and information about you.
Okay, I'm from Sudan. I was born here. I'm still living in the house I was born in, and my family's been here for a long time. My grandfather came here in about, I think in about May of 1884, and started working in the mine. The mine hadn't shipped any ore yet. There were just a few small pits, and eventually he got mining captain job, so he was in charge of everything underground at one time. And he told my dad, don't go work in the mines. But my dad worked at Mud Creek for a little while, and North America mine south of town here for a little while. And my grandfather passed away in 1913, so I never got to know him, but then my dad came up here and worked till in the late 40s, and then he retired. And I worked at Reserve Mining Company over in Babbitt for about 25 years. And then that closed, and I wound up eventually coming here and put in about 27 years of doing tours and that sort of thing. A little maintenance too, some winters, but anyway, that's kind of my background.
Let's talk a little bit about your growing up years. What were some of the things that you did as a child?
Well, I got a wife and 6 kids and 16 grandkids, but I see what they do now, and the way things were when we grew up, it was entirely different.
Talk a little bit about that.
Where the Sudan store is now, where the gas pumps are, there was a big rock sticking up there, a big ledge rock, and we used to sit on there and watch the cows come home. Because a bunch of Finn ladies on Church Street that had milk cows and supplied milk for part of the town anyway. And people up the other end where the Slovenians lived, they a lot of times had pigs and whatever, and we had chickens for a while. And our chickens would go fight with the neighbors' chickens, but it was a whole different world.
And as children, what were some of the things that you did for fun?
Well, we, like I said, we'd watch the cows come home about 4:30, and there was a mine whistle that blew at the starting and before shifts and stuff. And when the mine whistle blew, we know the cows were coming home, and they'd go in front of the club, in front of the hospital, and then in front of our street. Then they went down through a pasture, which is pretty much grown up now, and kind of followed the mud ditch, which mine water was pumped out and it ran through town. And we called it the mud ditch because it was red all the time. And went out, eventually went in the river across from the highway. But
talk a little bit about your schooling.
Schooling was, I went to school here for kindergarten through 12th grade. And Miss Kiddo was our kindergarten teacher. Miss Kiddo was everybody's kindergarten teacher for 80 years or 70 years or however long she worked. Mm-hmm. But she was long before I came, and taught long after. But she was a good teacher. Everybody loved her.
So there was an elementary school in Sudan at the time that you
There was elementary and junior high, okay. 7th, 8th, and 9th. And the Tower kids came up here for junior high, and then we went to Tower for senior high. And but they brought us home every day for lunch. The school had 2 buses, and some kids had to walk from way up the other end of town here, and that was close to a mile, 40 below, whatever, you know. That's just what we did. And but nowadays they bus everybody every place, and they got all kinds of other things going. They feed them in school, and wasn't none of that before.
As you were a child during the summer, other than watching the cows come home, what were some of the activities that you would engage in? I mean, was it hunting and fishing
Oh
and that
yeah,
sort of stuff
yeah.
too?
We were running around the woods all the time, and back then kids could run around all over it. Nowadays kids are afraid to go out of their house. Almost. But there was we all had guns, at home, and went hunting and stuff like that, and ran around the woods right back behind here. We used to walk through, hunted through all the mine property, got partridge, and nobody cared because everybody kind of knew how to handle a gun, and that was just part of our growing up. And our dads taught us things that my grandfather probably taught him, and then we taught our kids. And a lot of places around the country, kids don't get that anymore.
Now, when you say they taught you things, are you talking about hunting and fishing, or are you talking about more skilled activities?
Everything. When I was growing up, it was after the Depression, and World War II had gone on, and so stuff was hard to get. Food was rationed. A lot of people had big gardens. Some people plowed pretty much the whole yard up in gardens and did a lot of canning, all that kind of stuff. Picked berries and canned them. We had wood stoves in the house for heat, and part of your job was to cut wood and carry wood in. And if you wanted a cup of coffee, you might have to go out and get wood, start the fire in the kitchen stove and heat the kettle up. It's a little different now. And she was fine with that. It's just what everybody did.
Did you have an opportunity to talk with your dad about how different life was for him than it was for you?
Yeah, he was born in 1892, and so cars weren't invented yet, so everything was horses and horse and buggies, or walk. And on the lake, you paddled a canoe. They'd paddle all the way from here up to Trout Lake, go fishing, and so they were good at all that kind of stuff. And that's what they taught us kids. And my dad had quit deer hunting by the time I was born, but we did a lot of partridge hunting and shot a few rabbits too, I guess. And but we've taught our kids these skills that, about half the furniture in the house, either me or my dad made. And some of it turned out pretty good. It's been in use for 60 years and still holding up.
So how was the town different for your dad than it was for you?
Well, everything was open. There wasn't trees like it is now. And you could see the whole mining hill was pretty much bare. Everything had been logged off. We had some big trees in our yard, some big pines. And our street, there was several big houses there where kind of some of the big shots lived at one time or another.
And who were the big shots? Were they the mining company owners? I mean,
not the owners. It was owned by the mining company. It was Oliver Mining Company, which later was a part of U.S. Steel. But they had a guy who was in charge of everything, kind of a superintendent. And then you had a mining captain who was kind of second in command. And then you had foremen on each level. And there were several that were general foremen in charge of maybe a couple of levels. And then you had a general foreman up on the surface in charge of the shops and the surface stuff.
Was Sudan larger at that time, during the time your dad was growing up, or was it smaller?
At one time they had 1,800 guys working here in the mine. And so there was a lot more people. The town really wasn't much bigger, but everybody had 10, 12 kids. I mean, that's the way it was in the old days. And they all had something to do. You had wood to cut, gardens to raise, deer to shoot. And people lived on what they could do. And pay wasn't, well, it was better than a lot of places. And
how about the businesses?
Businesses in Tower started right away. Sudan was really here first, but Tower started about the same time. And they'd made kind of a gentleman's agreement between Tower and the mine that Sudan wouldn't have any businesses. no stores. Tower would have the stores, Sudan would have the mine. And that worked out for many years. And the Sudan store was once the main office for the mining company. Until, well, I don't know, it was the Oliver Club after when I was growing up. And the company had that. They had some pool tables, a reading room, counter where they sold candy and pop and stuff, and some room upstairs where you could go and listen to the radio and listen to ball games. Didn't have TV in those days. And
so the Oliver Club was for the miners themselves?
it was for the miners, and I think what the company had in mind was, we'll give the guys something to do here so they don't have to go to the bars and drunk. Coming to work drunk was not good. And it's still not good. But it was an alternative. And there was bars in Tower. And well, I think there was 6 or 7 grocery stores on the main street. My other grandfather on my mother's side had a store there. His brothers came from the old country. All my grandparents came from the old country.
When you say old country?
Sweden or Norway. My Norwegian grandfather had a grocery store. One was where the laundromat is now, in that building. And kitty corner across the street, there's several other buildings that they tore down after a while. And there'd been a number of things, but he had a store in there for a while.
The Zobitzes ended up.
And then Zobitz's was right in front of where Zoop's is now, where their parking lot is.
And so what was your grandmother's maiden name?
She was an Enquist, I think. And there was her my grandfather's 2 older brothers started here, started the store and everything, and my grandfather came several years later because he was younger, but he came and took over things, and they moved out to Everett, Washington, and that's just north of Seattle, and so I think there might be still relatives out there someplace. One of my sons is out there now living with his family, but you know, there was always stuff to do, and parents taught their kids to do stuff, to build stuff, to fix things, and I taught the same thing to my kids. My youngest daughter, I come home one day, she's changing tie rod ends on the front of her truck, you know, and doing things like that, and they could do that. One of my daughters was working in Duluth, and she called me from Virginia. She said, "My car broke down, it's squirting oil all over." I said, "Well, fix it." So she went to the mall or someplace and got duct tape and duct taped that thing together, got to Duluth.
So they really learned to problem solve.
Well, yeah, that's part
instead of calling a professional.
Yeah, they called, you were a professional in a sense because you could do everything. Mm-hmm. And kids aren't that way anymore. Mm-hmm. Now, my kids are pretty good at that.
Some of your pals and buddies as you were growing up?
Well, the kids in the neighborhood, there were, Lindblooms lived across the alley from us, and their parents were about the same age as my parents. And they had 2 older girls, and 2 boys that one was a year older than me, one was a year younger than me. We played together a lot as kids. And then there was other kids. There was Jimmy Shabodi's, and you interviewed his wife before. His folks lived where Lencey's live now, I think, just down from the club there. I still call it the club. It's a Sudan store, but us old guys still call it the club because that's what it was. And we'd go there and buy pop and candy, and for a penny you could get a whole bag of candy, you know. And but my kids, or my friend's dad, worked there as he'd gotten hurt in a mine one time, so he quit the mine and they put him in at the club as kind of a caretaker, run the place. And the guys would hang out there, and they used to have a little bit of near beer there. They called it. There was no alcohol in it, and but that's what they were doing. And guys would drink that, and kids could get pop and candy there, and then they had a old steam boiler in the basement. For heat, you know, they had radiators and steam, and it probably burned wood at one time, but it had a coal stoker, I think, on it, and he would fix that. And when Albert was sick, my dad would go and take care of the burner. When they were both sick, and they took care of the hospital too, so when they were both sick, I took care of the club boiler and the hospital boiler. And I was just a kid, maybe in junior high or something then.
Well, that you can call that your first job.
Well,
Or maybe that was your second job.
no, it was just, 1 or 2 days.
Uh-huh.
If the old guys are sick, but we could do things like that.
Uh-huh. How old were you when you officially started working a job?
I started working at Olson's store in Tower
Oh,
in '56 in the summer, and then in '57 in the summer, and then
And what did you do there?
butcher. But then I came up here. I went to college. I went to school here, and then I went to college up in Ely, and then I went to UMD for a couple years each. And
So was education really important for your family? I mean,
oh
did
yeah,
they-
yeah. The family was glad to do that, and it was cheap. The Ely College sent the bus all the way to Tower to pick us up for free every day. The books were all free, and the tuition up there was on quarter basis, and it was like $35 a quarter. And everybody was complaining because that went up. It was only $19 before that. But like I say, it was a different world. But
And at UMD, what did you major in?
well, I took industrial education, they called it, and I had well, in Tower, in the school shop, and you remember that, Mac McCumber was there, and he taught us a whole lot of everything. We had everything from blacksmith to machine shop to woodworking to mechanical drafting, architectural drafting, all of these different things that we learned as kids. So when I went to college, I knew a lot of this stuff already, and they had shops up in Ely. Took some classes there, and then down at UMD they had a shop even. Then after a while, shop is no good. We can't. You got to be computer everything. And so there come a generation where kids couldn't do nothing. That was different than what we could do, because we'd already done a lot of stuff. But so I went to work at Reserve a couple of summers when I was in college at UMD, I think, and well, I started 1959. I worked a summer over at Reserve. They hired summer kids, and back then, a lot of stuff wasn't mechanized like now. And I remember at the mine in Babbitt, at one time we had 72 pit laborers. And later they ran the place with 100 and some people, total, many years later. But and we had about 1,400 people maybe working there at that time. But I worked 2 summers as a laborer there.
Before we move into your mining career,
Yeah.
was there anything else about your growing up years in Tower-Soudan or the school that you remember fondly or made a big impact on you?
Well, I remember some of the teachers, and some were good, some we were a little bit afraid of.
And can you give us some of the names of those teachers?
Well, we had Miss Kiddo, and we had Miss Trigg, Miss Johnson. I think that was later Mac McCumber's wife. And we had some in high school, Ed Carola, and he was a teacher when he was a principal in Sudan when I started school. And as little kids, the principal, boy, you went in his office with fear and trembling, because he had a piece of garden hose about that long on his bookcase there in his office. You didn't want to get in trouble with Ed Carroll. And I remember having a kindergarten, I had to bring the absence slip in one day, and he said, "Here, bring this off to the office." Teacher told me, and so boy, I went in there and, with fear and trembling, and gave him the absence slip. But nowadays you'd probably go to jail if you even had a piece of hose on your desk. But kids got spankings then sometime if they misbehaved. And but there were other teachers, that we had.
Terry Brownell.
Terry Brownell.
Who were some of the characters that you remember growing up?
Oh, Billy Martin.
Talk about him.
And he was worked up here from day one just about. He was a blacksmith, worked in the shops down here. And we got a picture of some guys standing by the old press there. They had a big hydraulic press for forging things. And there were a bunch of guys there, but Billy was there. He's a little short guy. And he's the only one I recognize from that crew. But anyway, he lived on Main Street down here, had a little house. And I don't think he had running water. He had a pump out in the yard and an outhouse. And but later he got a little bit goofy maybe, or a little bit, because he'd say things as you went by and holler at cars. He'd lean on a fence post out in his front yard, you know. And one day I stopped at his house, I don't know what for, but I went in his kitchen. He was peeling potatoes. He had a big basin with water, and he was peeling potatoes. And he had a wood pile in the house. Of course, he burned wood, you know, to cook with and everything. And he had this fat little dog that had asthma or something all the time. And he was messing with the wood pile. And I said, Billy, what's the matter with your dog? Oh, he's chasing rats, he said. This is in a wood pile in the house.
So other than Billy, was there anyone else that you would say was kind of a character?
Oh,
Who were the people you looked up to when you were growing up?
Some of our neighbors. The doctor was always, he lived across the street, lived in the hospital at that time.
Who was that doctor? Who?
Dr. Lycola was there for a while, and Dr. Mollers, and there was two Dr. Burnses back in the old days, and we had relatives in Duluth, some of my mother's side, and we go down and visit them, but we get into Lakeside, that's in eastern Duluth there, and the train ran just a little below Superior Street, and we could pull a cord and the guy would let us off, you know, and we'd walk up to my uncle's house. They did that in those days.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember as a kid when they had a steam shovel here out in front where they'd stockpiled ore all winter because the boats weren't running on Lake Superior because it was froze. But in the spring they would crank up that old steam shovel. And as kids looking out the window at us at school, when you seen a black smoke coming out of that old shovel, boy, we were glad because we knew spring was coming then. But they had steam trains would come up to the mine, and out in front here there was a coal trestle on the way coming up the hill.
Was that for supplying heat here?
There was a little car that ran on a track up to the back of the engine house here, to apply, because the mine, everything ran on steam in the old days, and that's, you can see where that was, and the big steel trestle that went out over that level spot down there. The backside of that hill, the road goes just above that now. There was a big wooden trestle that went out there, and you could run the train out there, and he would dump off coal, and there was bins, and that backside of that trestle was all lined with wood. And then eventually they tore the trestle down, and they had a weigh scale there too, where you could weigh trucks and haul wood to people in town. $4 or $5 a ton maybe for coal, and you could get big lump coal, you know, like that, or you could get briquettes after a while.
So that's what people...
That's what people burned. Well, they burned wood until they got coal.
Mm-hmm. And so there was a lot of smoke in the town.
Well, you could always smell it, yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember when I went in the Army, I was down in Missouri in boot camp there, and they still had the old World War II barracks that we're in, with a coal stove in one end, and what would he have been, the major or colonel or something, they had an office for those guys. Had a big old cast iron wood stove in the middle of it, and some of the barracks had a kitchen with each company, and some of them still burned wood in the kitchen stove that they're cooking on for the whole crew. Ours had, I think, oil or gas or something, but the whole area, when all these wood stove fire up, smelled just like home.
Home away from home.
It wasn't home, though.
No.
That was Missouri.
So, Andy, let's talk a little bit about your career in the Soudan mine. When did you start working here?
I started after reserve closed. Reserve closed in '86. I think I started here in '87.
And how many years did you work
I
here?
worked 3 years, and then I got another job, and I ran a little manufacturing plant for about 3 years, and that wound up moving or whatever.
Was that
And-
in the area?
Yeah, it was in Sudan, in the old
Oh.
Sudan school.
Okay.
And then they eventually moved to Eveleth, or I think they eventually folded maybe. But I ran that for a while, and then I came back up here and worked for a whole bunch more years from about, what was it, about from 1891, maybe 92, up until I retired.
And when did you retire?
Oh, 3, 4 years ago, I guess now. You know, it's funny how time just goes by and you can't remember one year from the other after a while.
So how many years altogether would you say you worked in
I
this?
worked up here about 27 years. The last year I
27 years.
just worked off and on a little bit, but
Okay.
other times I was working, you know.
Talk about a typical day of work.
Well, that's a lot different than now too. And we used to start earlier, and they had a microphone outside here that the gal in the office would announce the next tour is leaving at such and such, and you could hear it all over the park here. So people would come in, you know, come in and get your tickets. And she had a regular little spiel she gave.
So you're talking about being a tour guide.
Tour guide, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't work here when mine was running. I came after it closed.
Okay, so you came after it closed.
Yeah, it was
All right.
already a state park then.
Okay.
But a lot of the stuff was still there. And when that first started out, a lot of the old miners took some training and talking to people and doing stuff, you know, tour type stuff. And then they were doing tours here.
Sanford Oja.
Sanford Oja. And he would tell some real whoppers sometimes. Some of those guys could, you know, they'd get some tourists going and they'd tell them all kinds of stuff.
And they would embellish a little
They
bit.
would embellish a little bit, yeah.
Oh, yes.
And maybe some people still embellish a little bit. But we've tried to get that back to more what it really was. And I remember giving a tour. There was a group from the cities that come up, and that guy, that was a school group, I think, of some kind, or Boy Scouts or whatever it was. Anyway, this guy had been up here coming every year for 25 years, I think, that he brought this school group up. And of course he was on some state thing when they made it a park. So he had something to do with that. So he was familiar with all that. But he was telling these kids, the mine goes way out under the lake. And one day I said, no, I said, the mine doesn't go. What do you mean? He says, I've been telling people that for 25 years. I said, no, the mine doesn't go under the lake. It runs parallel the other way. and some people thought it went way out under Sudan. No, that's not where the ore is.
So talk about a little bit about what you learned about mining in Sudan from your father or from the people that you knew and interviewed.
Well, my dad worked here when I was a kid, and so he would come home and tell stories about things, and bring home rocks, sometime pretty rocks or whatever, and sometimes he used to get crossways with the boss. That he was a foreman, but there was a captain that they would argue once in a while, which happens. That's normal, but he knew quite a bit about mining because my dad was involved in it right from the beginning almost, and my grandfather
And so what were their typical days like?
well, they ran the crews. When my grandfather was here, they were digging all these old pits. There's pits all along the whole top of the hill here, and there's probably about 18 or 20 shafts that most people don't know. Number 8 is the one we run here. Number 1 is way down that far end. And then some of them didn't go very deep. Number 3 got mined out by a pit after a while. Number 5 was right in the middle of the road going down to Stunts Bay, where there's a pit on either side, which has grown up so much with trees you can't hardly see that pits anymore. But right in the middle of that, they had a shaft, number 5 shaft, and it went down quite a ways and connected with other shafts. A lot of them connected underground. But there was a number 7 shaft just down the road here, and number 6 was that was behind where the office is now down there. But that was some of them, well, that one went down the pit a ways, and then they sunk a shaft in the bottom of the pit. So you could bring the cage up from the down underground and go right up the side of that pit and then dump it. And a lot of them old ones, they didn't have a skip under the man cage. They had they'd put the little ore car right in the cage. They had the tracks made so they could do that, and then when they got out here, they could run it over to the crusher and dump in the crusher, and then come back. And then later they had a steam engine for the crusher at one time too, and that all ran on big belts and stuff. And
Was it a 24-hour day?
yeah, it was 12-hour days, I think, in the old days,
Hard labor too.
and it was hard work.
Talk about what they did.
Pick and shovel, kind of a lot, and this ore was so hard. It wasn't like Mesabi Range. That's red ore, that's soft. And you shake it up a little bit with a blast and you could dig it. This one was solid. You had to drill it and blast it. And to start out, they were hand drilling. Had a piece of steel with a bit on the end, and a guy would stand and hold it in his hand, and two other guys beating on it with sledgehammers. And you hoped they were a friend. Because if you missed, you gotcha. You know, he could break your hand off. But they would keep turning. The guy would turn it as he beat on it, and it would eventually drill a hole, and they'd go in a ways, and then they put black powder in it, and then put a fuse in it, and a cap of some kind, and light that, and let her go.
By and large, did you consider all of their jobs hazardous?
Any job is hazardous in a way, if you're not careful what you're doing. I know I had an uncle that had several fingers blowed off of one hand, my dad's older brother, and he was down on one of the levels, and they were what did they call them? In the open pit mines we called it high bottom, but there's stuff sometime in a blast that didn't go, and you have a big chunk there, and they'd go back in there and clean out some, if there were drill holes left, the powder went, but the rock didn't break. And so they'd put powder in again, or I think at that time they were using dynamite, and push that in with a stick, you know, once you could clean that. They had a little thing with a spoon on the end, you could clean old powder and dirt and stuff out of the hole. And sometimes they drilled some new holes, but then they had air drills. It was a lot easier than doing it by hand.
Now, some of the earlier mines here, the way I understand it, were open pit.
Yeah,
And
right
then-
behind us here's a big one.
And then they found that the better ore was deeper, and that's when they decided to.
No, it was good all the way up.
Okay.
And it was good ore down on 27 too, that's the bottom level.
So
but,
why did they decide to concentrate on an underground mine then?
open pit got too hard. And you were out there in the cold, the rain, the wet. And this pit right back here behind the mine, that was, I think, about 3 levels deep at one point. And then the first level, and then dug a tunnel, came right out to number 8 shaft, where it is now, and they'd hoisted up the shaft. For a while, they were just hoisting it over the edge with a kind of a hoist, and they'd put some tracks down, you know, and have a little car on there and hoist it up. And they had one of them kind right over here in the West Tower pit. Then eventually they put number 9 shaft in. And they had several other tunnels that would come out on about 3 different levels into number 8 and into some of the other shafts where they could hoist it up. And that was the easier way of doing it, probably safer. And well, I was telling you about my uncle. They were put some dynamite in a hole, and then they would run. You had to get away in around the corner, you know, before you measured a fuse. You always timed the fuse. When you got a new package of fuse, you always took some of it and burned it to see for sure if it had a burning time, so you knew how much time you had. Anyway, the thing went off early, and he got hit with some rocks and lost a couple of fingers, I think, and he was busted his arm, I think, and he got hurt. So then after, when he got healed up, and back then they made him a pump man. So he just had to sit and make sure the pumps ran all night, the water pumps, because there's a lot of water comes in. But some places are dry and some places have water.
And I know that you were involved in a project with people that are trying to find and honor those who have died in the Sudan mine.
Well,
What can you tell me about
well, a
that?
few years ago, we've always wondered about that, and there were people, some of the guides that were throwing numbers around that weren't accurate at all. And some were saying there were hundreds of people died in these pits, and one guy used to say, I don't know how many people that, oh, number eight people died in this number 8 shaft, I think, or he had some number, and that was wrong. I knew that was wrong, and they would talk about all the, coffins lined up all over and dead bodies, and when you're telling stories to people, sometimes they can go to excess a little bit, but it really wasn't that way. So I went back to old death records, cemetery records, township records, and then what some people that I knew of that died when I was living.
Well, your contributions, I know, are valuable.
But I come up with, I think, 140 some altogether
From the moment it was
from when it was started.
instituted, okay.
And there was newspapers, it's sorry to say, you can't always believe them. Because just the other day I saw a newspaper article, and they had two pictures, and the writing underneath the pictures were switched. And that's somebody not proofreading. And there was, a few years ago, there was a guy come up here and did a big story on the mine in one of the papers. He had like a page and a half, big story, pictures, all kinds of printer, everything in there was wrong. And I don't know, he came, people talked to him up here, he taking notes, but he didn't get it. And he had everything so messed up. But people reading the paper think, "Oh, this is how it was." No, it wasn't. And you find that through the years.
When people did die, what happened? I mean, were there big funerals? Did the company pay for the funerals or help the families?
Not so much in the early days. There were a lot of single people here that came from the old country. Maybe had a wife and some kids back in the old country, and they had to make enough money to get them over, which happened a number of times. And then it was just, people going around the world looking for work. Because in the old countries, you had family farms, and then the kids would have to divide that up kind of, and eventually you got too many people trying to live off too little spaces, and so they'd take off and go somewhere else, which happened here. And my wife's grandfather came here to start. Well, a lot of them came here because there was nowhere else. There was no other range towns. Tower-Soudan were the only ones. And first you had to walk from Duluth to get up here. And then eventually, well, they started trying to mine gold up here down by where Arnson's is there in 1860s. And eventually they found the iron, and word about that got out. And so by the early 1880s, they were up after that. And but they just started digging right on top. They started down on this end, just where you come into the park, is where they loaded the first ore cars. It's all grown up with trees now. You can't hardly tell that. And there's a shaft there too. But where was I going with all this?
Well, I think you were talking about why people came to this area.
Okay. And they, a lot of people came here first. My wife's grandparents did, or great-grandparents, I think, and worked here for a little while. And then I think they had their first child. They were probably young then, and that one unfortunately died in birth, I think, or something. And then they had a second child, which was my wife's grandfather. And they lived here a while, and then they heard that they found ore over by where Mountain Iron is now. And so they went back to Old Mesabi, and by then you had the train that would go there.
And where was Old Mesabi?
Right where Erie Mining Company is, or was. It's in this side of Erie Mining Company, probably, and I think most of that got dug up with pit after a while. But then they took a wagon, they had a cow behind and the horses pulling it, and threw the kids all in the wagon, probably had to build a wagon. But then they went to go to Mountain Iron, and they stopped somewhere in Biwabik, or where Biwabik is now, and camped out the first night. Next night they went and camped somewhere where Virginia was. And then the third day, they got into where Mountain Iron is now. And there was a few people there, and they'd found some more there, so they were starting. And then eventually they went back to Virginia, and they had a boarding house there, and then it all burnt up at one time. And I think Virginia burnt twice maybe. Then they made them make everything out of bricks after a while instead of wood. But some of my wife's family is still around there. I think she's got a cousin or a second cousin that lives there, and he's older than I am, so. But he's still working, I think, doing things. But anyway, it was a place to come. A lot of people came, like a lot of the Finns came here, didn't like mining. They were farmers in the old country, a lot of them people. So they went out to embarrass. A lot of the Finns, a lot of the Swedes went over by Cook. And that's where one of my girls is living now, and she married a young fellow from Cook.
Is that where the logging then continued?
There was logging and there was farming. It's good land over there.
Okay.
Can't farm much here.
No.
I mean, you can dig up your yard and stuff, but
Farm rocks.
it's all rocks.
That's all rocks, yeah.
And hills and rocks, but over there is more level land.
Mm-hmm.
And my daughter, and she got two little kids, and her husband works as an works construction for a construction outfit.
Mm-hmm.
They float around, works at Mintac and all these mining companies. Mines don't do their own maintenance anymore like they used to when I was there.
Andy, what do you think is special about this area? What are the benefits of growing up in an area like Tower-Soudan?
It's a good place to live.
Tell me why.
I was born here, I grew up here, I like it here. I've been halfway around the world and back.
What are the
But-
qualities that make this a good place to live?
The people, the area, the woods, the lakes. You can turn a faucet on, the water runs. Not everybody has that.
No.
And when I was a kid, there was still a few people that had pumps. They had pumps around town. The funny company put those in. And one time they pumped water out of Lake Vermilion, and there's a water plant. They kind of had a purifying plant down by the shops down there. The building is still there. And water wasn't so good. Then they dug a well down where it's at now. But
What are the people like? What are the qualities of the people in this area that you enjoy or like?
well, people are good. You can have friends. You can have people you know. And they'd be willing to help you out if something happened. And the guys would get together in the fall, and somebody had a saw rig, and you'd have 3-4 families maybe in the alley, all cutting wood. And we used to get. We knew the guy that worked. That was head guy for the railroad section master or whatever they called him. And he had charge of the railroad halfway to Ely maybe, and halfway to Aurora or something. But he gave us railroad ties to burn. They were creosote soaked. They'd burn good, but with the rock and the railroad spikes and everything else on them, you had to really be careful cutting them. And sometimes you'd chip with an axe, around where you're going to cut, because otherwise the front was full of dirt. Get the saw done right away.
Mm-hmm.
And a guy had an old one-lunger saw machine, didn't have a radiator on, had a kind of a pan on top where you filled with water. And when the thing got running, it was one of those, it would fire every once in a while, and it would bang, 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 and then it would just kind of run, until it needed power again, and then it would fire again. And I didn't know what kind of device that was, and the water thing on top would be steaming, but it would turn that big circular saw they had, and they had it all mounted on kind of a trailer that they could pull around.
So
And
neighborhoods were important.
neighborhoods are important, yeah, and you kind of did things like that. And there was other people around town had saw rigs made out of Model A Fords or who knows what, the guys are pretty ingenious. You need a saw rig, we'll build one, And that's what they did, they built everything.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't throw much away. That's why my garage is full. But that comes from the old days when you always kept things because you were always building things. And my dad was that way. He would, if you need something, you make it. And that's why he made a good share of the furniture in our house, and some of it's really nice. And the school would let you in 1 or 2 nights a week for a shop at night. And guys could go up there and build things, use the saws and planers and stuff. And I used to go with them sometime when I was a kid. But then when I got in school, I took shop classes, and every year we built different things, and we learned. One of my grandsons came home, when was it last weekend? He came up from Duluth, and he had this big list on a piece of paper. He said, "We're talking about blacksmithing," he says, and he had a list of tools. He says, "Have you got any of these? Do you know what these are?" And I looked at his list. I says, "Yeah, I've had every one of them. Probably got most of them."
Andy, is there anything we haven't asked you that you'd like to share with us?
Well, we talked a little bit about the pits. And they alerted, the first trainload that went out of here was in July 31st of 1884. And it took that long to get the railroad built. And I think my grandfather might have worked on that railroad coming up and maybe walked the rest of the way in, because from Mesabi or someplace. That's where the railroad ended at that time. And but they started working these pits all by hand, and they had a couple of guys up early, 1882 I think, 2 guys and a kid, and there were still people looking for gold. So there's shafts, little shafts on Ely Island, some of the island, Pine Island, different places on the lake and around the lake, and in the woods around here you can find mine shafts that were dug, mostly by hand, and black powder. There's a place back in the woods there was a whole bunch of, I don't know what they are, about 10-gallon cans maybe or something, and black powder cans. They're still laying black in the woods behind one of them old pits. And you can find stuff like that laying around sometime. But they started, eventually went across the whole hill here with pits. And some were connected in between with tunnels too. And they had to build trestles going out the front. And most of the timber on the mining hill was cut. And around town, our yard had big pines in it, and they kind of liked them, so they left them. They're probably several hundred years old. I got one that died, and I got another one that's dying, I think now. But I was noticing this past year was a weird year for weather. We had lots of rain, cold. Summer didn't come till mid-June, I think, or July almost. But when it did, it did. The trees have really got thick, and there was good berries this year. Choke cherries, Indian plums, raspberries, and if the frost hadn't got them last spring, and it didn't, it missed most of them, these really got loaded. And coming from Tower on that S-curve, looking up here, you used to be able to see the mine. A few weeks ago, all you could see was the top of the head frame, because the trees have grown up on the front of the hill. Now they cut some, I think here, because I come the other day and I said, whoa, I can see the engine house and so the crew up here cut some of them trees down so you could see it, at least from the road. And you can almost drive by Sudan on the highway there and not know there's a town there, because the brush and the trees have all grown up so much. And that's been a little more unique this year than, I know even my backyard is really, really grown up with leaves and trees and stuff.
Okay, did you have any other questions to ask?
We could talk to this man for a long time, and with the the memorial to the deceased miners who died.
Well, there was I think several more that they found after I gave that to Richard Hansen and some of them.
I think that would be just.
They want to make a
worth-
nice plaque and put up here with all
right.
these names on
And
it.
your committee has been active, and that'll be another subject that people will be interested
The interesting thing with that, all them lists of people that I got from various places, and I took down the first people that came here pretty much were cousin Jacks from Cornwall, England, or south of England, and so they talked English. But a lot of the other people didn't. There were Finns, there was Austrians, there was Swedes, there was Italians, there was, and so these guys keeping track of the list and stuff. The guy in the office, these people would say their name and he'd write down what he thought it was. Wasn't nowhere near what it spelled like. So I'm looking at all these funny looking names, and then I tried to say them. And then I said, oh, that's what that is. And when I tried to say it, then the sounds were right. But it's spelled totally different. And so I found out what some of them, who some of them people were. And it just the way some guy in the early days had spelled it. My wife's grandfather, great-grandfather, came here, and he came from Finland. And over there, a lot of times when you worked at a place, you took the name of it. Talking about names, and my wife's, probably her great-grandfather, worked on a farm and took that name. And then when he came here, he brought that name with him. It was Rantala, which is a good Finnish name. And the guy here working says, we got too many Rantalas here. Your name is Santa now.
Oh.
And from then on, the name was Santa. So they could change people's names, and they did that every now and then. These guys from the old country, if their name was
That's interesting.
unpronounceable, they'd say, oh, you're this or that, and give it a Cousin Jack sound of some sort.
A lot of us really don't know who we are.
Well, yeah. But
All right, well, Andy, thank you so much for your wonderful, wonderful recollections of what life was like as you were growing up and some of the interesting things about mining.
yeah, well, there's a
And,
lot more you could say
yeah.
about mining, probably.
And I'm
but
sure there's a million more things, but we only have so much
Yeah,
time. So
Yeah.
thank you again, and we may be asking you again to do some interviews, but for right now, I
Yeah.
just want to thank you for all that you've shared with us.
well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Yes.
letting me do it.
Ditto.
Absolutely.
And I hope it's useful for something
It
anyway.
absolutely will be. Thank you.